Okay, good morning everybody. Whoops. Okay, good morning everybody. I'm gonna do the ultimate of vanity, introduce myself. I teach mainly at the University, the Université Libre de Bruxelles, but I'm also, since I think 15 years teaching at RITS, where I have the honor of, together with a number of colleagues, of supervising a number of PhDs. And it's about that, amongst many other things, I will talk. I will do something very old school. I've written a text, and I'll read it in an attempt not to be too boring. What I want to do is, in fact, take the presupposition or the pre-proposition of Jean-Paul van Bendegem from yesterday a step further and taking us into an economic and an institutional reflection. This is my title, Dirtying Your Hands, or maybe better would have been Getting Your Hands Dirty. And it will be about research, fieldwork, time, waterfleas, not waterfleas like in fleeing, and other misunderstandings. In recent years, more and more attention has been paid to the relation between art and science, another topic we've been discussing yesterday. Artists reside as artists in residence at universities, art schools invest in research, the arts sector invests in crossover platforms between arts and science, and artists can take a PhD degree. It is precisely this doctorate in the arts that brings us together here. I will not discuss the many unproductive misunderstandings and the institutional backroom discussions concerning this phenomenon. An interesting artist, according to me, conducts research, full stop. He questions himself, breaks new ground, looks for the unknown and uncertain, and graciously steers himself towards an existential crisis as an artist, time and again. And just like the artist, the scientist needs two things. That's what they have in common. One, imagination. Two, time. He is himself responsible for the first, albeit imagination cannot develop without time. And the current pressure on production and output, however, has transformed time into a rare commodity. It's something the academics amongst us can recognize very well. Research, however, always induces a form of deepening, always in function of your own artistic development, but also with both feet firmly anchored in reality. Therefore, research is the opposite of academic, namely the virtuoso mastery of a set of rules and conventions. In that sense, I think the same accounts for artists and scientists. Maybe, and that's the heart of my hypothesis here, maybe dramaturgy is the ideal term to grasp what research is, in Dutch, dramaturgie. Yeah. Dramaturgy is the force that connects an artistic practice, a social context, and a personal perception of reality. My comrade, Paul de Hert in Dutch, always refers to the three M's. Medium, maatschappij, maker. It doesn't work in English, unfortunately enough. Medium, maker, I would say, artist, and society. When the friction between those three is off balance, the research will fossilize. Too much medium will only produce conceptual self-referentiality, too much maker or artist leads to narcissism, and an exclusively social perspective kills the imagination. Dramaturgy is, however, not a form of intellectual self-legitimization. It is an invitation to keep exploring every option on the horizon through embodied reflection. Never to choose the evident road and to explore other realities behind the existing reality. I will be coming back to that. Dramaturgy allows you to translate primary material, and we'll have a couple of examples of primary material after me, whether it be documentation, observation, discussion, images, into a form of interpersonal imagination, keeping up as many options as possible without losing the urgency of the startup. Almost all PhD projects I have been allowed to supervise as an academic promoter within RITS have a specific relationship with social reality. In that sense, I think today certainly this morning we'll take a sort of different turn from yesterday. And they look for different new perspectives in order to represent that reality, sometimes through documentary strategies, but also through fiction. Showing the truth is not the first objective of these researchers/artists. Their work, which is not always about theater, aims at what a colleague of mine calls in her book The Theater of the Real, ontological theater doubt. It means that artists consciously try to blur the distinction between reality and fiction, just like in our everyday reality, in which the distinction is equally obscure and in which what is real is constantly under pressure. This form of research mostly relates to a specific social reality, but maybe the real is a better description, and has its own methodological challenges. Here we are again, methodology. Fieldwork has a central place in all of these research practices. Artists enter the real world with a camera, a notebook, or a recorder, literally to dirty their hands, to get their hands dirty. Their research shows a great affinity with anthropology and ethnography, research traditions that propose strategies and protocols to artists who are interested in fieldwork and at the same time invite them to reflect upon ethical questions. The most important being, what is my relationship to the reality I am intervening in? Making a documentary, for instance, is always a form of participating observation. You observe and register, but at the same time you are part of the reality you try to understand. Therefore, you also shape that reality. Precisely this shaping, or so to say, reshaping of reality constitutes the very power of the artist. In a sensitive way, he can make the invisible visible, not by documenting that reality and by describing it, that's the fate of the ethnographer, but by reimagining it, or even representing it, literally making it present again in a new way through another perspective. Maybe that is why the artist is maybe even a step ahead of the scientist, on condition, of course, that he allows himself the time to look for the same depth, that he takes time to engage in the field. Fieldwork is always about time, and losing time. A lot has already been written about the relationship between artist and scientist, often trying to explain that artists can also produce scientific insights, the project of Kundrisov yesterday being a good example. Or the other way around, that scientists can also be creative, Jean-Paul's example of a beautiful theory. But maybe the essence of their kinship is to be found elsewhere, in their questioning potential, in the refusal to frame complex realities in simple schemes. Precisely that instability is more and more under pressure these days in science as well as in the arts. This is a long row of aquariums with yellow light. Fish at the bottom, wires, lamps, the whole thing is humming constantly. It looks complicated, but it's also beautiful. It seems to be a scientific laboratory, but it is an art installation. Its name is Blue Shift Log 1. It's an artwork by biologist Angelo Vermeulen. He developed this beautiful project in 2006 in collaboration with an evolutionary biologist called Luc de Meester from the KU Leuven. Blue Shift brings together different organisms in a small, tiny ecosystem. The two are fish and water fleas. The fish are at the bottom, the fleas are at the top. The water fleas can be in both parts, because there is a sort of horizontal partition between the two parts through which the fish can pass, to which the water fleas can go back and forth, but the fish cannot. And so the fish are blocked down. The fish are at the bottom, the water fleas in both parts. Whenever a visitor approaches the installation, the light changes to blue. And without noticing, the visitor becomes a murderer of a bunch of water fleas, at least. Because water fleas are photosensitive organisms. They do not really like blue light, as that means clear water and therefore danger, as the fleas are no longer protected from the fish. Whenever a visitor approaches the installation and changes the light from yellow to blue, the fleas flee the light through the partition right into the mouths of their enemies. The nice thing about Blue Shift is that it is a spectator that completes the work. The installation itself functions as a sort of ecology, which as time moves on will adapt itself to the environmental circumstances. Ultimately, the waterfleas will select themselves. These who will not learn to flee the blue light will survive. With Blue Shift, the boundary between science and art becomes water thin. In the fine dialogue book Baudelaire in Cyberspace, who I recommend to everybody who's dealing with the difficult field of artistic research, by Vermeulen and his colleague VUB art philosopher Antoon van den Braambussen, the latter one, Van den Braambussen, comments the work of the first one. And he says, "Your installations deconstruct the line between art and science. They reveal an unfathomable depth between both fields, the impossibility of a strict separation, creating an ambiguous interspace." And it's about the interspace I will be talking. Vermeulen adds that at that moment, the artist-scientist becomes a sort of fool or a clown, a figure who dares to upturn existing orders and conventions. As art as well as science are being crammed today into the straitjacket of all sorts of regulations, as the laws of productivity and efficiency prevail in both domains, there seems to be less and less room for the fool, who merely pulls the legs of every authority and academism. Of course, this intertwining between art and science is not new at all. One could put it the other way around. The separation between the two, between art and science, is a historical exception. The deep entanglement of both runs as a thread through the history of early modern art and science, sometimes with the necessary sense of spectacle. The anatomical preparations of Frederik Ruijs are a nice example of this cocktail between art, science, and spectacle. In his cabinet, art, knowledge, and spectacle coincide. Ruijs was not only a scientist, but maybe in the first place a theater director or an installation artist. His preparations were real mise-en-scènes, in which the deceased come to life so realistically, and I will quote him in Dutch, dat men ze van een levendig en slapend mens niet kan onderscheiden. That they cannot be distinguished from a living and sleeping human being. So there is some sort of Gothic edge to his anatomic installation, to use an anachronism. Probably the last objective of his cabinets was the production of factual scientific knowledge. In the first place, there were spectacles, in which the spectator's experience itself is allowed to behold prevailed. In the cabinet of Ruijs, the preparation becomes a real spectacle, as he embellishes parts with lace or damask, or makes a child rest on a placenta as if it were a pillow. The cabinet thus gives a shape to a new corporality, the inside body as a newly discovered terrain, but also capitalizes on a couple of fundamental underlying questions. Who is man? But by whom was he created? What happens to a body upon our death? Who or what animates our bodies? Etc., etc. So Ruijs combines his scientific spectacles with typical Baroque veritas elements, such as plumes or strings of pearls, and thus invites the spectator to reflect upon life and death. He also was a kind of fool, who deliberately fiddled with the boundaries between art and science, at the same time presenting human beings with an existential mirror. Through his art, which was science at the same time, Ruijs held up a mirror to humankind so that people could think about their place in reality. Today, in our hyperactive and hyperproductive world, there seems to be less and less rooms for these kind of fools. Today, we all desire clarity, uniformity, unequivocal answers. We do not even need more confusion. Reality in itself is already confusing enough. Everything needs to be explicable and efficient and has to contribute to economic development. The current research for art and science cannot be detached from these developments, maybe even what we're doing here. Research and development, R&D, co-creation, creativity, teamwork, and above all, innovation are the buzzwords humming in many policy documents that once more want to bring together arts and science. That way, hoping to realize, sorry for the newspeak, a competitive advantage for the institution or to frame complex realities in simple schemes. Precisely that instability is more and more under pressure these days, in science as well as in the arts. And this innovation I was talking about is best of all translated into a product that fits a market and thus will lead to economic profitability. It seems today that this emphasis on productivity also has entailed a formatting of the experiment within the scientific institutions, so I'm also criticizing my own institution, which is the university, as well as in the field of the arts. There seems to be less and less room for wildness, recklessness. Curiosity is replaced by calculation and career planning. While reality keeps getting more and more confused, scientists and artists are more and more under pressure to conform their practices to a series of implicit norms. Thus scientists more and more resemble, and this is the paradox of my whole argument, thus scientists resemble more and more artists and vice versa. Still, their fundamental affinity is elsewhere. The essence of their identity of both artist and scientist is namely the loss of time, and therefore the postponement of productivity against the short-windedness, kortademigheid of the system. Tinkering, trying once again, making the wrong choice, stubbornly reconsidering the same question again and again, daring to think beyond reality in order to get a better understanding of that, to come to a better understanding of that very same reality. Just like the fool, when we laugh about him, uncomfortably knowing that he is the only one who really tells the truth. And we often seem to find that truth in the interspace Van den Bussen and Vermeulen were talking about. Maybe this so-called interspace can be found in what I have called dramaturgy, the continuous negotiation between an artist and the reality through the medium. Therefore, the artist can do nothing but relate to the world outside. A famous quote by Karl Kraus says, if you want to criticize reality, you have to quote it. And yet, that quotation is never just a quotation. It is the result of an artistic appropriation, even a retranslation. And then, art functions as a kind of searchlight that can make reality visible that could not be observed before. Maybe that is one of the most persistent misunderstandings about documentary art, about documentaries in general, about documentary theater, whether it comes to film or theater, namely that in that kind of art, every as if would be absent. What we see would thus be a direct reconstruction of reality that existed once. The opposite, however, is true. Showing reality always involves a rereading of the same reality. Only that way we can make visible the fundamental theatrical nature of reality itself. Only that way can it be shown that reality is steered and determined by codes and conventions, that it is a game that functions thanks to the same as if. Theater, but also films, documentaries as far as I'm concerned, makes the spectator aware of that mediation, of the fundamentally constructed nature of reality. It shows our everyday reality steered by theater. Precisely there lies the true strength of artistic research. In fact, I'm just imposing my own agenda to the discussion. To uncover what escapes our attention in our society of spectacle. And Jan will be showing a clear example of what escapes to society, or to this spectacle. Maybe that is why dramaturgy in the classic sense of the word becomes more important, namely as the art of telling stories, the narrative architecture of a performance. The more unreliable the information sources, false truth, alternative truth, the more complicated the representation systems we're in. Think of The Truman Show, which is still one of the most relevant films to understand our present-day reality. The more complex our entrance to reality, the larger the need for a narrative, and thus a point of view. This is a plea to take art beyond postmodernism. The development of that point of view, of that story, requires time, slowness. But sadly enough, there is less and less room for that slowness. Also, artistic research, this self-proclaimed new paradigm, must be efficient and purposeful, must generate output and must be quantifiable. Artistic research should contribute to the development of our creative industries and is thus considered to be an economic investment that should pay off, return on investment, one way or the other. And thus artists, just like academics, are no longer authorities on the basis of their imagination, of their power to rethink reality as it is, but they become more and more bureaucratic accountants, and it's a self-portrait of my own career, become more and more bureaucratic accountants of their own creative economy. At first sight, there are not many alternatives. Tina, there is no alternative. If you do not join in, you put yourself outside of the system. You are being unrealistic, naive. But maybe we should all just altogether cherish the lack of realism. Cherish our naivete. Or lack of realism, let's say it that way. I have learned that you have a great responsibility in this discussion as a supervisor. The supervisor should safeguard the balance between pragmatism and the sense of adventure, between efficiency and loss of time. That is not an easy task. Moreover, you have little or no theory or method to hold on to. Every project is different and time and again demonstrates the boundaries and limitations of your own expertise, certainly if you're an academic promoter as me. As you are, after all, I'm not a peer of my PhD students. I'm not an artist in the strict sense. You're not a colleague in the strict sense of the word. Hence the importance of the dialogue with the artistic supervisor, of course. Every artistic research project requires a specific method, another interaction between knowledge and feeling, another kind of intuition. And this method changes all the time, also within the same process. And there is the biggest struggle for any researcher. Do not work too efficiently, but do everything to achieve that result. Do not close off a line of thought or of an experimentation too quickly, just to be comfortable. Do not be deliberately blind, but keep searching. Also, the supervisor has to learn to live with this fundamental uncertainty. Even if the institutional context he operates within asks even ever so emphatically for more efficiency, for more PhD diplomas. So let us agree here and now. Care, and the central word is care, development and ethics should always prevail over output. That, I think, is the true bridge between artists and scientists. We only have to want this as badly as possible. Voilà, thank you.